much for your patience. So before we move to the concluding session this afternoon, there may be some delegations who would wish to come back specifically on section 3 of the text. There was a possibility yesterday that there may be a wish to deliver 1 or 2 more statements. So I'm going to open the floor now for that. Any concluding interventions on section 3, just indicate. If not, we'll move ahead. But if there are some, we will hear them now. There doesn't seem to be. I know. Oh, yes. Australia. Yes, please. Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Australia shares the sentiments you expressed yesterday, reflecting the commitment states have shown to this process and to achieving a meaningful declaration, capable of improving the protection of civilians in the context of armed conflict in populated areas. We recognise the challenges posed by the use of a WILPF and welcome the efforts of the international community and Ireland's leadership in addressing this issue. It is of paramount importance that we ensure that the commitments outlined in this declaration are clear, capable of being implemented, and best serve the goal of improving civilian protection in armed conflict, a goal which has been drawn into sharp focus by the humanitarian disaster resulting from Russia's unprovoked, unjust, and illegal invasion of Ukraine. In this regard, we have a number of suggestions in addition to our comments on section 2 yesterday, which relate to key areas in this draft declaration. We will submit detailed comments on all 4 sections to you in writing. However, we do want to take the opportunity to make a few points of particular importance to us on the floor. Many of these reflect areas highlighted by other delegations over the past 2 days. Chair, Australia has paid particular attention to section 3 of the declaration. As the operative section of the declaration, this section is of central importance. Australia shares the significant concerns raised by other delegations in relation to the wording of paragraph 3.3. We cannot support this paragraph as currently drafted, but would like to offer some suggestions we think would better achieve the balance between the goal of improving the protection of civilians and recognising legitimate military imperatives. We have been listening with interest to the suggestions of other delegations in relation to this section and welcome the constructive engagement on alternative wording. A particular issue for our delegation is wording which calls on forces to adopt policies and practices to avoid civilian harm. We think this could be erroneously interpreted as a presumptive ban on the use of explosive weapons as a class in populated areas. We would suggest the terminology avoid and in any event minimise to better align with IHL obligations. We would also support the phrasing offered by our colleagues from the United States around implementing a range of policies and practices to help avoid civilian harm, or phrasing offered by the United Kingdom to avoid, restrict, or refrain where feasible. Chair, like many other delegations, we also maintain reservations around the terminology reverberating effects. Reverberating effects is not a defined concept under IHL, and potentially inconsistent interpretations risk generating ambiguity. This may undermine the practical effect of the declaration. To that extent, we would echo the caution expressed by others in relation to this term and suggest replacing reverberating effects with indirect effects or severe and long-lasting indirect effects for clarity and consistency. This is particularly the case in relation to operative sections such as paragraph 3.4. Chair, we welcome the recommencement of discussions on this draft declaration. We look forward to continuing to engage with you and the international community towards achieving a declaration which strikes the delicate balance between recognising that explosive weapons remain a legitimate means of warfare under IHL while making meaningful contributions to the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And continuing with section 3, I have next speaker Algeria to be followed by Nigeria. So Algeria, you have the floor.
J'aimerais m'excuser pour.
I would like to apologize for making a general statement. I hope that's possible because we didn't have the opportunity to do it before. Chair, the Algerian delegation would like to thank Ireland for the efforts they have taken in the process for developing a political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and for having taken into account the comments and observations expressed by different stakeholders throughout this process. I would like to use this opportunity to highlight some general points as follows. Algeria, given its historic attachment to international humanitarian law, would like to express its support aiming to strengthen the protection of civilians from the impact of armed conflicts and to limit this impact on civilians in line with international humanitarian law. As an example, there is the recent accession of my country to the Declaration on Security in Schools. In fact, the development of the nature of modern armed conflicts and the means and methods of combat highlight the challenges that civilians face across the entire world, despite the principle according to which people can that there is not limited means and methods of combat. And this raises a number of questions regarding the applicability of international humanitarian law and its effectiveness, despite the efforts taken by the international community over past decades to strengthen the protection of civilians during armed conflict. The situation, unfortunately, remains a source of great concern. And this concern is broadly shared across the United Nations, as well as in the African Union's Council for Peace and Security, which through its communique of 17th of July 2019 expressed its concern on this matter. Chair, my delegation would like to thank you for presenting the revised version of the draft declaration that was circulated on the 3rd of March 2022. And there is a prospect for broadening points in common to achieve tangible results and to ensure the broader support for this version. Of course, we are placing this declaration within the context of international obligations that states are a party to in order to strengthen the respect and effective implementation of international humanitarian law. My delegation commends the reaffirmation in the draft declaration of the commitment to respecting international humanitarian law during armed conflict, and we share the noble interest that drives this process, which aims to strengthen the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. And this is in line with the imperative to fully implement the rules and principles that already exist in IHL in order to relieve the suffering of civilians and to stop aggravated humanitarian attacks that are in our collective memory. We have closely followed the active and constructive consultations on this draft, and we continue to think that points in common that we're not seeking to create new roles should be really highlighted in this new draft declaration. And the same goes for reaffirming our attachment to IHL and the full compliance with these rules and principles. My delegation would also like to recall the position expressed by the Arab group during the previous consultations in March 2021, which stressed that all reference to non-state armed groups in the draft should be strictly limited to IHL and should be without prejudice to the principle of self-determination and resistance against foreign aggression and occupation. We recommend introducing a reference in line with this in the draft declaration, and we'd also like to use this opportunity to propose the inclusion of wording that clarifies that the follow-up and implementation of the declaration needs to be ensured in line with obligations arising from instruments to which states are a party. Finally, my delegation would like to stress that the protection of civilians must comply with the principles of universality and non-selectivity, and that international law must be upheld under all circumstances to guarantee the follow-up of humanitarian principles and simply to protect human life, which is an obligation and not an option. Thank you.
Give the floor next to Nigeria, to be followed by Peru. Nigeria, you have the floor.
Thank you for giving Nigeria the floor. Mr. Chair, as this is the first time my delegation is taking the floor during these consultations in the context of WILPF, we wish to highlight few relevant aspects related to our views on this process. Mr. Chair, as one of the 19 African countries who met in Maputo in November 2017 to share knowledge and evidence on the distinctive pattern of harm caused to civilians by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, with a view to exploring steps to address same at political and operational level, we wish to renew our commitment to pursue the actualization of this document as a preliminary basis for future consideration of a more internationally binding instrument. Nigeria places high priority on the preservation of civilian lives and property, especially in cases of armed conflicts capable of destabilizing quality of life and infrastructure in line with international humanitarian law. Nigeria also places high priority on the prevention of actions which could potentially pose a threat in the long term to the well-being of civilians, including the abandoning of explosive remnants of war as a result of armed conflicts. Mr. Chair, my delegation wishes to reiterate its support for cooperation and partnerships with international organizations and civil society organizations to draw upon their relevant expertise and support in the area of victim assistance and rehabilitation. We further reiterate our support for the promotion of bilateral and regional cooperation through sharing of experiences, good practices, and expertise on reducing the harm caused by explosive weapons to civilians. In this regard, we have examined the current edition of the draft declaration being considered. However, we are fully aware of the fact that other delegations are still registering concerns and making proposals for revisions. We shall do so when necessary. Finally, Nigeria remains open to engage constructively in the process of establishing a political declaration on WILPF, as previously supported in Maputo, and we express our gratitude to the Republic of Ireland for the time and effort invested into developing the draft. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Peru.
Señor presidente, sí. Gracias, señor presidente. Agradezco la oportunidad.
Chair, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. Yesterday, we were not able to take the floor because we did not have the time to speak about section 3, and we would like to focus on paragraph 3.3, which is the heart of this political declaration and which can be further strengthened. For Peru, in order to effectively strengthen the protection of civilians in populated areas, the political declaration must put in the presumption of the non-use of explosive weapons with a clear commitment for states not to use these explosive weapons in populated areas unless there are mitigation measures that are taken to limit the civilian damage, which is the avoidance policy. We would like to see a firm commitment to avoid the use of, and we would like to strengthen what is referred to by restricting or refraining from. We don't think that is strong enough. given that explosive weapons are often used indiscriminately against civilians. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Are there any other statements under item 3? Yes, I can't. Air Wars, yes, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you again for your time, and thank you for all being so engaged throughout this process. As stated previously, as a member of INEW, we align ourselves with all the statements made throughout these talks, and we really welcome the place that civil society has had throughout these negotiations. We would like now just to add a quick comment in relation to Operative Section 3. Underpinning these negotiations is an international acknowledgement that we must move beyond a status quo where collateral damage is seen as an accepted and inevitable consequence of modern conflict without a critical understanding of what this means for those civilians on the ground. We believe that this understanding can and must be informed by a strong evidence base, collected both by civil society and the states and militaries engaging in conflict. Yet, importantly, states cannot and should not outsource their responsibility for this data collection entirely to civil society. We have also heard throughout these negotiations a call for a declaration that's realistic, but without a shared mechanism or a commitment to tracking and monitoring the civilian harm from military action, how can we know what that reality really is? This is a point that the declaration should clearly address, yet as emphasized by several others yesterday, a commitment to tracking civilian harm is currently missing from the operative section of the text. Although it's mentioned within the preamble, there is no explicit requirement for states and their armed forces to track civilian harm in real time during military operations, to collect historical data on civilian harm, or systematically to collect information on damage to civilian objects. As we also heard yesterday, states have pushed for including ever more equivocal language in section 4.2. This makes it even more critical that states include an additional commitment as per section 3.4 bis 2, and we quote, establish capabilities to track, analyze, respond to, and learn from incidents of civilian harm in real time, including damage to civilian objects, end quote. Civil society groups such as ours have shown that it is possible to collect this data, and with it, we can demonstrate a clear and compelling link between civilian harm and population density, for example, a link between incidents of civilian harm and longer-term humanitarian needs, and ultimately, we can use that data to demonstrate a central point. The adherence to IHL, while critical in minimizing civilian casualties, is in and of itself not sufficient to mitigate significant civilian harm during urban fighting where wide area effect explosive weapons are being used. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just see if there are any more statements. Niger, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. The delegation of Niger commends the organizers of this meeting for the opportunity that has been given, namely to look at the moral and operational challenges of explosive weapons used in populated areas in order to protect civilians and to face the devastating humanitarian consequences that arise from this. In fact, civilians face considerable risks every time they move, and they must constantly think about how they move around and agricultural land that they may be using, and thus this exacerbates the vulnerabilities of certain groups, particularly those in the Sahel, who are engaged in an asymmetric war against terrorist groups and other bandits. Chair, my delegation believes that this declaration can strengthen other existing legal frameworks to protect civilians against the collateral damage and help to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals which it refers to. We think it is essential to highlight the fact that the duty for protecting civilians in armed conflicts in populated areas is not exclusively incumbent upon states, but it is also incumbent upon state actors. And most armed conflicts in Africa highlight this over the past decade, particularly in the Great Lakes region, the Horn of Africa, and Central Africa, and recently in East Africa, where these types of conflicts are absurd wars that are led by actors that are not respecting international law or relevant international conventions of international humanitarian law. This declaration will not be effective if these actors do not stop using these explosive weapons. So while we commend this step, we believe that we shouldn't be discouraged. States should not be discouraged from protecting populations that are tested by these forces of evil. In other words, we need to avoid that states are the only recipients of this declaration, because we need to recognize the existence of international humanitarian law and to follow this with determination and courage and lucidity. To conclude, I would like to highlight certain points which should guide our thoughts on this matter. The current declaration should lead to concrete actions, otherwise it will just remain another instrument for protecting civilians in armed conflicts. Respecting international humanitarian law is incumbent upon all parties involved in armed conflicts, and the perpetrators of violations must be held responsible for their acts. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And if there are no further interventions under Section 3, we will close this section. And so before we wrap up today, I would just like to make a few concluding remarks, and I'll also make available, we'll open the floor for any reflections that you may have on the process and on the progress we have made over the last 3 days. So the first thing I need to do is to thank you really, really sincerely for your constructive engagement and your contributions over the last 3 days. They have definitely proven that we needed to have in-person discussions and in-person consultations here in Geneva. And the round of consultations that we've had have delivered exactly what we were hoping for in terms of narrowing down the number of issues that remain open in the text. And that has happened because of the constructiveness with which you have engaged. And I definitely would say that we have sensed a real sense in the room of commitment to this process. And that is hugely welcome, not least because of the broader environment in which we are meeting and which we noted at the opening of our meetings. So we have a greater sense of perspective now on the key issues, and I think we have moved the process forward. Now, just to be clear, I said yesterday that we do not intend to table a draft this afternoon. We will need a little more time to analyze fully your interventions and also the proposals that you submit in writing, in written form to us. Thank you to those of you who have submitted already, and I strongly encourage those who haven't, to do so as quickly as possible. And we will be following up over the next week to make sure that we have that we have all of the interventions, because that input is going to be very important in the next phase. So it's not really my job today to anticipate what changes will be made in the final version which we produce, but in asking for your reflections, I thought I might first give our sense first of where we see the process following the last 3 days. Our exchange on Section 1, I felt, was very substantive, and the interventions were clear in expressing the importance of this section for framing the issue and setting out the fundamental need for a political declaration. And in saying this, I should add that, of course, every section in the declaration is linked. It has to be seen as a whole. They are all linked. It's very clear in section 1 that while there will be some tweaks required, some changes, we are moving towards a convergence in that section. We all see the need for a civilian-centered approach underpinned by a call for the full respect of IHL in armed conflict. We also heard that consistency and accuracy in the terminology used in the preamble is particularly important because it sets the boundaries and understandings for the linked operational commitments that follow. So I can assure you that we will work with your help to harmonize terminology. We must be careful, however, not to overburden the text, which is a political text, and so we don't want to overburden it with too much technical definition. On section 2, virtually every delegation spoke of the importance of setting out existing obligations and commitments under applicable international law, including IHL and international human rights law. There are some drafting issues remaining, but we've seen significant movement towards a convergence in this section also. We've maintained the understanding from all delegations that the declaration should not set out to reinterpret applicable international law or create any new legal standards or obligations. And I think it's important to state this again. We have stated it regularly throughout, but it's a critical point. Was reaffirming the applicability of IHL to all parties to armed conflict in the declaration is especially important for some delegations. Additionally, it is essential that the text makes clear that IHL applies to all forms of armed conflict and does not imply a hierarchy of obligations for WILPF. Section 3, we always have known that section 3 was going to be possibly the most difficult or the most detailed area for discussion. But I think we've had a particularly useful and particularly interactive discussion on section 3. Now, there are clearly differences of opinion remaining, but we have seen a very positive, solution-oriented approach to the section. And I again want to thank the delegations that took the floor with constructive proposals and a spirit of flexibility. We have received proposals in terms of language, but also I know that these proposals are still being discussed between and among delegations, and this is good. This is what we want to happen, and I would strongly encourage these discussions to continue, and we will remain in contact with you on these discussions. There is a dynamic developing that is exactly what we would have hoped for. So in this section, we have also been clear that a simple restatement of IHL is not sufficient. Otherwise, I think we wouldn't need a political declaration. The declaration must have commitments that are meaningful and must bring added value in terms of the protection of civilians. And from talking to you, I get the sense that that is the clear view. This is the fundamental reason for our engagement in this process. So we, the team, the Irish team, will continue to reach out to delegations on this section in general, and in particular on paragraph 3.3 to further refine the divergences that exist. But again, I say it is hopeful and positive that those discussions have started between you already. On section 4, we are very pleased that a number of delegations believe the text is moving in the right direction and indeed is almost ready for adoption. There are some drafting issues that will need to be resolved, and further work will be required on the issues such as data collection and victim assistance to get the language fully correct. But nevertheless, we are really encouraged that a large number of delegations see great value in improving international cooperation and assistance on these issues. There also remains a strong interest and support for conducting practical activities that would help develop best practices for the protection of civilians. And this is essential for making a real difference on the ground. And throughout, we have said, and I think there is general agreement, that we are not simply working on a formula of words in a political declaration. We want to make a real difference and an impact on the ground and to foster behavioural change. We have heard calls for greater inclusivity in any follow-on activities to ensure that not only states, but also international organisations and civil society play an active role in the implementation of the political declaration. But I think it's very important that we state and that we understand that the follow-on mechanism is not going to be a forum to judge individual states' compliance with IHL. And I know that's an issue that has been raised with us by a number of, well, quite a good number of states. So that's just generally our view of where we stand following these consultations. I cannot stress strongly enough how encouraged we are by the spirit with which they have been, by which you have participated with them. On that note, rather than, I'm not going to close the meeting because later on I'll come back with our plans for the future, but I would like to give an opportunity now and to open the floor to delegations to share their views and reflections on the discussions we've just had and on their suggestions for the way ahead. And then we can respond and close the meeting by setting out our view as to how we should proceed. So I'm going to open the floor for some reflections. They don't have to be actually kind of comprehensive reflections, but just an idea of how you feel the session has gone and where we are and where we need to go in the period ahead. Thank you very much. I open the floor, and just raise your nameplate if you would like to intervene. If not, of course, we won't force you. INEW has the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. On behalf of INEW, and as we come to a close, I'd like to share a few reflections on the past couple of days and the direction that we need to be moving in. We have appreciated the constructive way that most delegations have approached these discussions. And as we said at the start of this meeting, we believe that the draft declaration text holds the potential to make a meaningful contribution to the protection of civilians. But certain decisions will now need to be made. So let us remind ourselves of the aim and purpose of this initiative. The ambition of this agreement is to strengthen the protection of civilians. It must prevent and reduce harm from the use of explosive weapons in towns, cities, and other populated areas. It must set out expectations for behaviour through policy change, and that can be enacted in practice. And it must do more than simply reaffirm the need for states to abide by the law. And there is an urgency to this. On a daily basis, we see images of civilian suffering and devastation in Ukraine, Yemen, Syria, Ethiopia, Iraq, and elsewhere. Centrally, this political declaration needs to establish a presumption against the use of explosive weapons when they have wide area effects in populated areas, owing to the scale of blast and fragmentation, inaccuracy of delivery, and firing of multiple munitions across an area. When explosive weapons have wide area effects, they present a significant and heightened likelihood of harm to civilians. This recognition and the factors that produce wide area effects need to be embedded in the text to signpost how the central commitments should be implemented by armed forces. Adoption of strong commitments in this area are critical to showing that this community is working seriously to improve protection for civilians. The political declaration must also address the humanitarian impacts from bombing and shelling in populated areas by assisting victims and driving forward actions to understand and respond to the harms caused. This also means addressing the reverberating effects, which stem from damage and destruction to infrastructure and are often interconnected, including damage and destruction to housing, hospitals and schools, power networks, and water and sanitation systems. Such effects can far outweigh the immediate civilian death toll from an attack. They can be experienced by people in areas far beyond the location of the initial attack, and the impacts can be felt for weeks, months, or even years after the initial attack. Work on the explosive weapons agenda has been ongoing for over a decade now. The concept of reverberating effects is firmly embedded in key literature. There is broad understanding of what this term means, which is consistent across materials produced by different agencies and entities. And there's an opportunity through the follow-up work to implement the declaration and build understandings and policies on how to address reverberating effects. As others have said, much of the success of this work will come down to its effective implementation and the follow-up process of work that follows. The Safe Schools Declaration provides a useful example of how our collective work under this political declaration could be progressed. There have been declaration meetings organised every couple of years, gathering, endorsing and other interested states with international and civil society organisations, working without a formal mechanism to do so and without being overly prescriptive of how that process of work will be organised. Nor is it too onerous on endorsing states beyond implementing the commitments in the declaration. INEW is ready to play a key role as a central partner in this future process of work. It will be by building this community of practice based on continued collaboration between states and organisations working together to promote progressive implementation of the declaration that its eventual success will depend. Ireland, we appreciate your leadership on this issue and on this declaration process. We appeal to you now in this final stage of the process and as you work to finalise the text over the next few weeks, to be guided by developing a text that embodies actions that will have clear humanitarian benefit and effect. This declaration can be an instrument that saves lives, and it's on this basis, addressing the humanitarian consequences of bombing and shelling in towns, cities, and other populated areas, that we've been participating in this process. We want to be able to support this declaration, and we want to play an active role in working with states and others to encourage states to support it and endorse it, and work with others to promote its implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think I see plowshares, is it? There is a plaque up at the back.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Chair. Yes. Thank you, Chair. Let me start by thanking Ireland, and in particular you and your team, for the steady hand with which you have led this process. Please know that you have our full support and encouragement now and as we move into the final stages of this process, with a view to adopting a political declaration that has a concrete and meaningful impact on the protection of civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. As this round of consultations comes to a close, we would like to address what we consider to be a few misconceptions about this process and about the text of the political declaration draft itself. First, no wording that has been proposed so far around the use of a WIPA suggests a blanket prohibition of explosive weapons. The object of this process is to strengthen the protection of civilians in the specific context of explosive weapons with wide area effects being used in populated areas, which has resulted in an indisputable and well-documented pattern of harm to civilian lives, livelihoods, and infrastructure. Second, the fact that the declaration will be a political and not a legal document does not in and of itself prevent the establishment of a concrete follow-up mechanism to gauge progress and to assess its effective implementation. Third, it is not only the indiscriminate use of a WIPA that causes harm. The pattern of harm to civilians over time and across conflict zones makes it clear that the use of a WIPA is a well-entrenched practice among several militaries that continues to harm civilians even when that use is not recognized as indiscriminate. Fourth, the current wording in 3.3, which says, and I quote, restricting or refraining from, is confusing and lacks linguistic coherence. To be clear, to restrict and to refrain from are not synonymous terms. Neither should the political declaration give states a choice between two commitments, thereby giving the option to choose the least restrictive among them. Civilians are being killed and maimed from the use of a WIPA every single day, including today. It is imperative that this process establish the highest possible standard for the protection of civilians. This can be achieved through a presumption of non-use codified in the text of the political declaration with a specific commitment to avoid the use of a WIPA. Fifth, no one denies the value of international humanitarian law or the imperative necessity to enhance states' compliance with their obligations under IHL, including the key precepts of distinction, precaution, and proportionality. But it behooves us to aim higher, to go farther, to push the envelope. Whatever expression one might choose, this exercise must add value to the existing normative regime for the protection of civilians. Finally, Chair, and perhaps most importantly, this is a time for boldness. We have come a long way, but there remain areas that, depending on the decisions that are made in the next few weeks, will lead to a stronger or a weaker political declaration. We do hope that the states involved in this process have the courage, the foresight, indeed the audacity to craft a political declaration that helps reduce human suffering. And we look forward to the adoption of a robust political declaration that honors civilian victims and that we can all be proud of. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Next on the list is Luxembourg, to be followed by France. So Luxembourg, you have the floor.
Cher Président, chers collègues.
Chairman, colleagues, since it is the first time that my delegation is taking the floor, I'd like to thank first the delegation of Ireland for the consultations and for the way these consultations were managed. And thanks to the constructive contributions made by delegations, now we have a much better text, a more mature text that can be the foundation for the protection of civilians from explosive weapons in populated areas. Luxembourg is flexible in terms of language because the key proposals that were made to bring the positions of delegations closer together, we already are well on our way, especially when we keep in mind that we should ensure humanitarian access in all armed conflicts and also the mitigation of the effects of use of weapons in populated areas, among other things. We also would like to praise the commitment to the collection and sharing of information that sometimes are constrained by the operational situation. We must include our humanitarian partners and facilitate data collection, especially by the UN, the ICRC, and NGOs. Finally, Luxembourg would like to reiterate the call that was made by delegations. This is not an end in itself, but it is a step aimed at protecting civilians better in armed conflicts in all circumstances. And this is why we are now putting the stones into the foundation of our work to better protect civilians in populated areas. Thank you. Thank you, says the chair, and I give the floor to France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. We'd sincerely like to thank you for organizing these consultations. Unfortunately, current events remind us why we are here today and now why we have to work together to bring together our voices and also our means to better protect civilians in conflicts. At this very moment, as we meet, Russia continues its indiscriminate attacks that target deliberately civilians and civilian infrastructure through the use of explosive weapons in violation of IHL in areas where civilians are present in large numbers. We cannot ignore this context. We cannot ignore these flagrant violations of IHL, these indiscriminate shellings and bombings of areas, attacks on schools and hospitals, indiscriminate attacks against civilian areas. All of these practices should be strongly condemned. As you know, France is fully mobilized in the process of this political declaration, and in this respect, we would like to praise your efforts aimed at helping us achieve consensus here. This declaration should not just simply help us evolve in our policies, but it also should bring together the highest number of states in order to work together to better respect rules and principles of IHL and build their capacities, as well as adopt specific measures in order to ensure greater protection of civilian populations. Thank you.
Merci. And I give the floor next to ICRC, to be followed by Humanity and Inclusion. ICRC, you have the floor.
Allow me, Excellency, to thank you and congratulate you once again for the open, transparent, and inclusive manner in which you have conducted these consultations. We are encouraged by the fact that so many delegations acknowledge clearly the urgent need to strengthen the protection of civilians when hostilities take place in urban areas. We are also encouraged by the firm commitment to ensure full compliance with international humanitarian law, in particular in environments where respect for the law is very challenging, such as in cities. We look forward to seeing both put in practice by all parties to armed conflicts. Over the past decade, in many conflicts around the world, the use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas has taken an unacceptable toll on civilians. It is measured in the thousands of women, men, boys, and girls who were killed, injured, and psychologically traumatized. In the number of homes, hospitals, and schools destroyed, and the vital infrastructure disrupted. In the millions displaced, struggling to get back their life and dignity. In the countless unexploded ordnance littering streets and backyards, and in the huge development setbacks and billions in recovery costs. Reducing the grave risk that heavy explosive weapons pose to civilians is an urgent humanitarian imperative. As we have said time and again, it is also too often a legal requirement. Inability to change the fate of civilians in urban areas in a meaningful manner would be a failure of the international community as a whole. What does it mean to comply with international humanitarian law? It means reviewing and adapting policies and practices to reflect not only operational reality, but also humanitarian considerations. It means acknowledging the risk posed by those weapons which raise most concern when assessing the evidence offered by recent urban warfare. It means implementing concrete measures to avoid or at least minimize such risk. Ultimately, it means taking into consideration the risk of civilian harm in its full extent, direct or indirect, short or long term, when assessing the legality of attacks and of the choice of using specific weapons. There may be specific instances where heavy explosive weapons can be used in accordance with IHL, even in populated areas. But in many, if not most situations, this will be very difficult to achieve. It requires specific mitigation measures to be put in place to limit the wide area effect of such weapon and the high risk of civilian harm. This also requires identifying, developing, planning for, and implementing at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels alternative weapons, munitions, and tactics. Effectively protecting civilian lives may require taking a step back and, as a matter of policy, avoiding the use of such weapons in order to prevent the risk of civilian harm and of IHL violations. In our view, the political declaration should establish the framework for such a policy and for the urgently needed shift in mindset, policies, and practices. As we said in our opening statement, considering that every state involved in armed conflict over the last decade have claimed to have fully complied with IHL, simply recommitting to do so is unlikely to change the situation in a meaningful manner. We therefore urge states to keep the bar high and to produce and adopt a strong political declarations with meaningful concrete commitments capable of effecting real change on the ground. As many have said, the political declaration will not be the end of efforts to protect civilians, and we fully agree. It will need to be implemented through practical measures to drastically curb the use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas. These measures must serve to implement the law and go as much beyond the law as necessary to effectively strengthen the protection of civilians based on the political commitments adopted through the declarations. These commitments are therefore critical both for the declaration itself, but also for the follow-up process. What matters is the recognition that existing policy and practices and their implementation in urban warfare over the last decade does not adequately protect the civilian population from devastating humanitarian consequences, and that therefore it is urgent to take the necessary measures to change this situation. By avoiding the use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas through preventive and mitigation measures, parties to armed conflict will both reduce civilian harm and facilitate respect for international humanitarian law, a goal I know we all share. We look forward to seeing this process conclude with a meaningful outcome worthy of the time and effort so many delegations have put into it, and first and foremost, your delegation, Mr. Chairman. Civilians suffering daily in armed conflict around the world from the use of heavy explosive weapons ill-suited to urban warfare deserve an outcome that is commensurate with the gaping need to strengthen their protection and achieve the very object and purpose of international humanitarian law. We trust that the delegation in this room will be able to rise to the challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Humanity and Inclusion, to be followed by Friends World Committee for Consultation. Humanity and Inclusion, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. As a closing remark, let me please share again why Humanity and Inclusion has been engaged in this process in the past decade and why we are so often raising our voice. In fact, in our daily operations in areas affected by armed conflict, we are closest to those who are affected by the use of explosive weapons. Through long and painful physical rehabilitation sessions, we work together to rebuild their lives by empowering their participation in their communities, but we also hear their experiences. And on 1,000 stories that we have heard, situations we saw and experienced ourselves, we build our policy requests, draft these speeches, and make remarks to states here in this room, but also work on capital levels. Hundreds of thousands of citizens have been signing our petitions and shared concerns about this issue. Hundreds of parliamentarians across 8 countries in Europe have engaged to support a strong language in the political declaration. There is a wide support on this issue outside this room. The civilian harm that we encounter in our operations is our driver here, as it was obvious since the beginning. There is an unacceptable amount of human suffering caused by the use of explosive weapons, and there is an urgent need to work with all parties to the conflict to change these practices. Clearly, there are significant challenges militaries are exposed to while conducting operations in close proximity to civilians and civilian objects. However, hearing simply that IHL is fully respected while military operations were conducted in cities such as Raqqa or Mosul is hard for us to understand because we witnessed the great humanitarian consequences arising from such operations. We consider that this is where the great value of a process such as this one lies. A political process where states, including those with active military operations, will gather with different actors such as UN agencies, international organizations, civil society, to discuss the obvious: how to protect civilians, how this practice to change, improve and strengthen, to spare the lives and limbs of people in areas affected by conflicts of different nature. We strongly believe that it will be our failure to leave this room agreeing that simply restating existing laws will reduce civilian harm. It will be a failure for all of us who came here with the intention to reduce the harm in the first place. We believe that the political declaration, which is a non-legally binding document, should be ambitiously built on a strong text centered around a clear commitment against the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. 19 African states endorsed Maputo Communique. 23 Latin American and Caribbean states endorsed Santiago Communique, calling for all actors in conflict to avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. This text must lead to better recognition of the scope of the damage caused to civilians, including effects linked to destruction of their homes and infrastructure, also recognizing the severity of reverberating effects, or whatever we decide to call them in the end. This text must also include sincere commitments to provide adequate assistance to injured, survivors, family of those injured and killed, as well as affected communities, and to ensure access to principled humanitarian aid for affected population. We sincerely hope that a strong language will be agreed by states at the end of this process. We have noted and we welcome the constructive and positive comments made by some delegations during the last 3 days. Change is needed, and we hope to see it within this text. 11 years in Syria, 7 years in Yemen, and over a month in Ukraine have taught us that explosive weapons with wide area effects should not be used in towns and cities and other populated areas. The status quo is no longer an option. I thank you, Ireland, for providing us with the space to raise our concerns. I would like to thank all the states that I hope will take our considerations into account. Thank you again, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Friends World Committee for Consultation, to be followed by Austria. You have the floor.
Chair, explosive weapons in populated areas do harm civilians. They endanger their lives, but also violate other fundamental human rights of those living in those areas. We also believe that the goal of this declaration should be to end the use of explosive weapons in populated areas as the single greatest impact to protecting civilians and reducing civilian harm. In this collaborative effort to strengthen the protection of civilians, we echo the calls from delegations and civil society to name and change behaviour that is causing humanitarian harm. This declaration has the chance to set the standards and commitments to do so. In this light, we would also caution against narrowing the scope to indiscriminate use or illegal use of explosive weapons, which would undermine the value of this declaration and its effective implementation to avoid humanitarian harm, protect civilians, civilian objects, and all human rights. This is synonymous to the worrying tendency to narrowing scope on illegal, illicit, or diverted weapons. All weapons have an impact on human rights. As such, Section 3.3 should set forth a strong standard to enact such behavioural change, to include a broad range of actors and commitments for states to take policies and practices that avoid or refrain from the use of explosive weapons and prevent direct and indirect reverberating effects. To strengthen this declaration in fulfilling its aim, an addition of the existing mechanisms and entities, such as the Arms Trade Treaty in the preambular section, would provide practical ground for the commitments in the operative sections. This is not to be overly prescriptive, but to ensure what steps in existing mechanisms may be taken to reduce harm to civilians and civilian objects and to avoid or refrain from the use of explosive weapons. Finally, we welcome delegations and civil society who recognise the complementarity and mutually reinforcing nature of international human rights law and international humanitarian law in this endeavour, including additions that states continue to have obligations to respect, protect, and fulfil human rights in armed conflict, and must exercise human rights due diligence related to the use of explosive weapons, and must assess the human rights impacts of such. We would like to end with a sincere recognition and thanks for the collaborative spirit in which this process has been undertaken, and welcome future opportunities to continue supporting member states to implement and go beyond their legal commitment to the protection and promotion of human rights for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next on the list is Austria, to be followed by Norwegian People's Aid. Austria, you have the floor.
I thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon to you and to all colleagues. Mr. Chair, the past 2 days have been very intense and we believe very successful. We really appreciate the constructive spirit and the outcome-oriented focus that was displayed by all delegations. It's encouraging to see the broad interest in swiftly finalizing and adopting the political declaration. And it was also encouraging to see the broad range of states engaging, including those that suffered civilian harm caused by explosive weapons in populated areas, to those directly and indirectly affected by armed conflict, to those currently engaged in an armed conflict. Explosive weapons is an issue that concerns us all, as the important contributions of international organizations and the ICRC and civil society once again demonstrated this week. Mr. Chair, thank you very much for the immense effort on the consultations, the discussions and opportunities to exchange positions. We would like to wholeheartedly congratulate you and your team for seeking a balance between all views expressed while maintaining the ambition of a political declaration that provides added value and that will make a difference for civilians. Mr. Chair, the evidence is clear. About 70% of victims of EVIPA are civilians, and these 90% are, of course, direct victims. And these 90% don't even reflect the indirect harm and the reverberating effects of explosive weapons use in populated areas on civilians. Yet looking at the pictures of recent conflicts in cities, the dramatic civilian catastrophe caused by large-scale use of EVIPA in cities is evident. The need to exercise restraint and refrain from such use is clear, and looking at these devastating pictures of humanitarian and civilian harm from recent urban conflict, I think we all agree that such use should definitely be avoided. Yet over the years, what we've seen rather points to the contrary. You said yesterday, Mr. Chair, we need to send a strong signal that the international community is determined to address the humanitarian harm caused by EVIPA, and we wholeheartedly agree with that. This political declaration is our opportunity to work together and to make a difference for civilians on the ground. But we, of course, need to keep a minimum level, or not a minimum level, a strong level of ambition. Looking at the evidence of 90% of civilian victims, it's not good enough to simply state that existing international law is the framework and that there are also cases of legitimate use of explosive weapons. We should take an extra step. We need to have commitments that express the true willingness to work and to make a difference. In section 3, we heard a lot of very welcome suggestions, such as the ICRC suggestions on point 3.3 and point 3.6. We also support making 3.4 and 3.5 operational and concrete by specifying the commitments to include implementation tools, processes, policies, and practices. The most carefully looked at element in the declaration will, of course, remain 3.3. It has always been. But unfortunately, from our perspective, the discussion has been convoluted a bit over the years by focusing on specific words rather than the true meaning of the words, or sometimes even the entire sentence around that word. A commitment to avoid the use of explosive weapons is, of course, not a prohibition of explosive weapons nor of their use. It's a commitment to more carefully consider the use of explosive weapons, including the specific context, the payload, and the broader implications, namely the direct and reverberating effects, and of course compliance with IHL. And of course the reason for this proposed and more careful consideration is the necessity to reduce civilian harm. And protecting civilians is an obligation under existing international law. And 90% of victims of use of explosive weapons being civilians, of course, is not acceptable. Chile and Mexico yesterday explained eloquently how such a commitment would reflect the legal considerations based on applying existing IHL rules. They would contribute to a more accurate assessment of the actual impact of an attack and strengthen compliance with IHL, including by taking into account indirected and reverberating effects, which are amplified in urban areas. Such a commitment on a political level would of course also raise the political attention on the protection of civilians and strengthen IHL compliance more generally. This is urgently needed looking at the conflicts of today. So as we approach the finishing line for our negotiations, we urge all to embrace the opportunity to find an ambitious formulation, a commitment that expresses that states are determined to reduce the unacceptable pattern of harm and that will refine their policies towards that end by more carefully considering potential uses of explosive weapons in populated areas, efforts to avoid restricting or refraining from the use, all with the objective of changing the unacceptable pattern of harm. Mr. Chair, the best result will be achieved through true inclusive multilateral cooperation, and we very much commend you on the transparent and exclusive manner you and your team have conducted this process. We encourage all to work together towards a strong, meaningful political declaration. The humanitarian and security impact of EVIPA concerns us all, and the effects of armed conflict ultimately are also borne by all, no matter the relative size of our military. We encourage all states to accelerate, to work together and finalize this declaration, adopt it at the political level, and start working on its implementation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor next to Norwegian People's Aid, to be followed by WILPF. Norwegian People's Aid, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thanks to you and all of your colleagues for taking us to where we are now in this process. Norwegian People's Aid, NPA, is part of INEW. And as an organization, we are engaged in clearing explosive ordnance and protecting civilians from explosive weapons at large. We have worked on this for 30 years now in 40 different countries. And we observe that the use of EVIPA and contamination by explosive ordnance in urban areas are presenting new challenges to our sector. By way of summary, we have taken note of many constructive points raised during these days. And here are a few examples of what we would like to reiterate and support. We welcome what we perceive as a pretty broad agreement to replace the term explosive remnants of war with explosive ordnance, which is a more well-defined term, but a broader term, and that would expand the scope in a useful way. We also welcome statements on inserting a reference to risk education in point 3.5. Risk education should take place immediately where civilians are at risk from explosive ordnance. And as NPA, we see risk education as a category of activities designed to help civilians mitigate the risks related to explosive weapons they are subject to. So this entails that risk education should be properly adapted to the specific risks posed by explosive weapons in a particular context, such as the types of explosive ordnance fired into or found in an area. Another observation we have is that, at least in our understanding, there seems to be an agreement that we can delete the word natural in front of environment, where we speak of the environment. And NPA supports the Conflict and Environment Observatory in that more attention should be paid to the relationship between environmental protection and the protection of civilians, and also on how the environment is negatively affected by armed conflict and the use of explosive weapons. A minute ago, I actually suggested the adoption of a well-defined term, namely explosive ordnance. Whereas there is, of course, no harm in using terminology that is clearly defined elsewhere, we also see no problem in including language that doesn't have a legal definition. Reverberating effects is such a term. We encourage delegations to not reject notions on the basis of not being a legal concept in this political declaration. NPA thinks that the description of reverberating effects adds to explaining the humanitarian consequences that we all care about. So it's very important to describe these effects as they constitute core humanitarian issues. To conclude, we highlight that this is indeed a political declaration that should stay focused on the objective of significantly strengthening the protection of civilians. It should, for example, separate legal and political commitments, such as by removing the reference to in accordance with IHL in 3.3. We appeal to all delegations present in this room and beyond to conclude this declaration process in such a way that it can be an instrument that saves lives by addressing the humanitarian consequences of bombing and shelling in towns, cities, and other populated areas. And as was very usefully pointed out several times, the work to continuously improve the protection of civilians does of course not end with this text, but should be a big push in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And next on the list is WILPF, to be followed by Belgium.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We thank you and your team for the efforts to drive this process forward and to ensure its transparency and inclusivity. We welcome the constructive contributions from states, international organizations, and civil society, and we look forward to continuing this work to protect civilians through the process that you've outlined today. As anyone can see from reading the news each day, these negotiations are not an academic exercise. Bombing is going on all around us. People are dying, living in fear, being separated from their families, struggling to survive conflict and its aftermath. This is the reality of our world, but it does not have to be this way. These are political, military, and economic choices made by governments to use explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, to turn cities into battlefields. Thus, this declaration indeed must be realistic, in that it must commit states to change their behavior in order to save lives. A realistic declaration would honestly acknowledge the harms being caused by the policies and practices of militarily active states. It would account for the direct as well as the reverberating harms from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, the disruptions to life and well-being that are caused by the destruction resulting from this use. It would account for the impediments to human rights, the gendered harms, the harms to people with disability, and people who are facing marginalization and exclusion. A realistic definition would commit states to actually change their behavior because it is clear that change is imperative. The reality is that current implementation and interpretation of existing law is insufficient to protect civilians, and so we need to be clear about what is and is not acceptable. The language in paragraph 3.3 must be clear in its commitment by states to not use explosive weapons in populated areas. States that are bombing civilians should not have the final word on what is or is not acceptable, feasible, or realistic. It must be the experience of victims and survivors that guides this declaration's words and its implementation. We hope to be able to support this declaration and promote it amongst our partners and colleagues who are living in conflict. This declaration needs to have meaning for their lives. If the declaration is not sufficiently strong, it will not add value. This is realism. We also hope to be able to engage in a follow-up process to ensure the declaration's implementation. This cannot just be a piece of paper. Its commitments need to be taken seriously and acted upon. States will need to collaborate with international organizations, civil society, and affected communities to translate this declaration into meaningful action. With this declaration, we can set a common standard and expectation for the protection of civilians. WILPF urges states to make the choice to save lives and prevent suffering. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Belgium, to be followed by Mexico and Chile. Belgium, you have the floor.
For organizing this round of inclusive consultations and thank colleagues for the interesting exchanges. We have listened carefully and we would like to make some additional remarks on language that was proposed that we can support at this stage in line with Belgium's position in other fora. I realize these remarks may be a little bit untimely. They go beyond section 3 and at the same time don't mean to be closing remarks. And for the sake of clarity, they don't in any way preclude our position of any of the other remarks, including those that were mentioned by member states representatives, which we will continue to study, or on our general position on the new version of the draft declaration. I will be brief. Concerning victim assistance, we think a reference of the word victim in the first phrase of para 4.4 would be useful. We would also support a reference of what victim assistance may include, such as suggested by INEW, or in a shorter fashion by ICRC in 4.4 in fine. On mine risk education, the UN has proposed the introduction of the provision of risk education in para 3.5, which we would support. Third, in line of Belgium's engagement on subject of children and armed conflict and IHL, we are happy to support the following suggestions by the UN. In 1.2, the additions of particularly children and education. In 1.3, the additional reference to healthcare facilities. In 4.4, the addition of age-sensitive. Finally, on humanitarian access, my delegation has already made the point on this topic in section 2. However, humanitarian access has become increasingly difficult to achieve in modern-day warfare. Therefore, a clear reference to this IHL principle in section 4 is appropriate, for instance, by adding it at the end of 4.5 or by adding a standalone paragraph. Mr. Chairman, we thank you for your efforts throughout this process and hope for a new draft version of the political declaration that could enjoy support by a wide number of member states. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Mexico and Chile, to be followed by New Zealand. Mexico, Chile, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Cathy. We have very brief remarks. We're tired. As our delegations, Mexico and Chile, would like to take the floor to thank you, Chair. Thank Ireland for its tireless, transparent, and inclusive efforts leading the WILPF process. And before you, Austria. Ambassador, we agree with the summary you've provided us, which highlighted the challenges in each section. We have 3 general points. First, thank all our colleagues here in the room. Thank the ICRC, OCHA, civil society, for what in our view has been a very respectful and hopefully fruitful exchange. We think we all understand where we are regarding the text and our national positions. We agree with you that we have all shown a strong commitment with the process. We would also like to, in second place, acknowledge with thanks the flexibility that we have heard from all delegations in their positions, from most of delegations. There's actually a bridging effort going on. And last but not least, we would like to reiterate that in our view, we need a strong text with meaningful commitments that includes an express commitment to avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas because of the significant and foreseeable likelihood of their indiscriminate effects. We need common standards, operational policies. We need to make a difference in the ground, in victims' lives. We believe we owe them this much. And this is only the beginning, but we are up for more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor next to New Zealand, to be followed by the Conflict and Environment Observatory. New Zealand, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, on behalf of the New Zealand delegation, I would again extend our thanks and gratitude to Ireland for its leadership and hard work in driving this process forward over the last 3 years and this week. As we might say in rugby-playing nations like New Zealand and Ireland, you have driven the ball forward, and now it's a question of heaving it over the line for a successful try. Then maybe we can go to the pub. Being New Zealand, we had to work in a rugby analogy somewhere. But thanks to the consultations of the last 3 days, we feel we have a better sense of where views of delegations lie on the text. And we're encouraged that despite some drafting issues remaining, there genuinely seems to be common purpose and convergence in this room toward enhancing civilian protection from explosive weapons use. In the current international environment, such a positive dynamic certainly cannot be taken for granted. And we wish to commend other delegations for their constructive engagement, even if we don't necessarily agree on all specifics yet. No doubt some hard compromises remain in the text, and maybe we won't be so thankful to you once we see the next political declaration draft. But we are in the business of negotiation here, and we have confidence in you and your delegation to help us find a formula that is pragmatic yet ambitious and principled while implementable. We don't need to add further to the thoughtful take you offered, Mr. Chair, on where the text stands for now, since we mostly share it. We would, however, underline the importance of the political declaration for Aotearoa in New Zealand in highlighting the significance of this issue and raising awareness of the particular characteristics and implications of the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in urban conflict. As Austria noted, explosive weapons issues are of importance for us all. The powerful and affecting testimony we've heard this week from civil society has helped to bring home these effects, and it powerfully reinforces why we must achieve meaningful progress. It's been a long road to get us to this point. The pandemic has meant this political declaration process has been lengthier than any of us, least of all you, Mr. Chair, perhaps envisaged. But it is worth recalling that the origins of WILPF work go back at least as far as 2008. And in that regard, New Zealand wishes to acknowledge the important data collection and conceptual and policy innovation of civil society that informs our understanding of WILPF, especially INEW members, the United Nations, and the Red Cross movement. Without their research and advocacy over many years, we would not be here now. And their engagement will need to continue once this political declaration is adopted, and the signs seem good that it will be, so as to help inform states toward implementing it in a manner better protecting civilians in conflict. If we need any reminder of what happens when states fail in that responsibility, we need only look to the appalling impacts of explosive weapons use on civilians in Ukraine following Russia's illegal invasion, which, to reiterate, New Zealand unambiguously condemns. Lastly, Mr. Chair, having thanked Ireland Incorporated, I'd like to extend particular thanks to you and your team for your hard work, transparency, and balanced and inclusive approach to our work so far. I thank you.
Thank you very much. We might see you in the pub before the declaration is completed. Thank you very much. And I'm going to give the floor now to the Conflict and Environment Observatory, to be followed by the United States. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and our thanks to Ireland. We are encouraged that the environment is included in the draft text. The environmental impacts of WILPF must not be overlooked. Attention to the environment and its relationship with the protection of civilians and human health is critically important. Protection of the environment is a vital component of protection of civilians. So I am just reiterating points here, but please bear with me, because we do know that the use of a WILPF causes destruction and damage, leading to pollution and environmental risks. These risks include the generation and debris of hazardous materials, ground contamination, poor air quality, collapse of solid waste and wastewater infrastructure, contamination of groundwater, contamination of rivers, and contamination of potable water supplies. Data collection and impact assessments and follow-up assistance must include environmental considerations to support the protection of civilians. The term reverberating effects is acceptable in terms of environmental impacts. UNIDIR have done commendable work in developing a set of indicators to measure the reverberating effects of on civilians from the use of a WILPF, which focuses on the Sustainable Development Goals and currently includes 19 indicators for environmental degradation. We will welcome the political declaration and states acknowledging the importance of the environment and addressing environmental impacts in protecting civilians. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to the United States, to be followed by Article 36. United States, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me join the chorus to thank you personally, Ambassador Gaffey, as well as your delegation, for the way you all have planned, conducted, and directed these. My delegation believes that we have had a full and robust discussion of the draft text that you so ably prepared over these last 3 days. While ultimately the declaration that emerges from these consultations will be made by governments. This session and previous ones have enabled us to hear the clear, well-informed, and detailed views of civil society, the ICRC, and other groups represented here. Thank all of you. I believe our governments can say that we hear you and we appreciate your views. The United States wants to be in a position to join this declaration and contribute to a focused and non-politicized follow-on process that can lead to real improvements in military policies and practices, and ultimately to more protection for civilians caught up in armed conflict. But before we can get to that point, there are still tough drafting issues and decisions ahead, and we have to get them right. The U.S. delegation pledges our goodwill to help to get to a positive outcome. We look forward to doing so, including at our next and final meeting in June. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Article 36.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's clear for all of us that human suffering and civilian suffering in conflict is our starting point in these conversations. And I think for many of us here in Europe, people based in Europe, the impact of conflict on civilians seems much closer and more pressing and more urgent than it has done in many years. But of course, the suffering we're seeing now has been going on globally, continuously over past decades. People killed and injured, people losing family members, losing homes, schools, hospitals. This pattern of suffering has been consistent over decades now, in which civil society has been gathering data on these impacts. We've had a decade also of the UN Secretary General calling for action on this issue, action to address the impact of explosive weapons in populated areas. So we warmly appreciate and congratulate you, Ireland, on taking us all forward together in taking that action. And we appreciate the states who've led action on this issue before you. I think we see the need to recognize in this declaration that explosive weapons that have wide area effects, when they're used in populated areas, they expose civilians to an unacceptable risk of harm, whether that's being driven by the inaccuracy of weapon delivery or by the wide blast and fragmentation effects or by the use of multiple warheads to saturate an area with explosive force. Where those effects occur outside of the military objective, they're inevitably bearing down upon the civilian population. And I think in those contexts, we can see a foreseeability of that civilian harm. And if it's foreseeable, then it should be avoidable for us. We also need to recognize and engage with the way that harms propagate and spread from the use of explosive weapons beyond those direct effects of blast. We see, of course, a worsening of suffering that comes from the destruction of homes, the destruction of schools, the destruction of hospitals. But also when elements of interconnected infrastructure are destroyed, those harms propagate and expand still further in time and space, causing public health impacts far beyond and away from the initial blast. I think we could recognize here that not all of those effects are going to be fully foreseeable to military operators in a specific instance, but those effects still exist. And we need to be able to recognize that as a community and acknowledge that. And to acknowledge that if these effects exist, we can do our best to take action to respond to those effects. And we should at least acknowledge also that this is the reality for civilian populations living in conflict-affected environments, that they will be living with these wider public health effects. And we need a declaration also that responds to the rights and needs of victims and their families and affected communities. And I think we've been very encouraged by the clear development of support in that area during the consultations here this week. We believe that a declaration can be agreed that meets these objectives. And to that end, I would echo Alex from Austria's comments just now that we need to be ambitious together towards achieving those objectives. I think it's fair to say Article 36 as an organization, we want to be encouraging states to join this declaration. We want to be supporting states in joining this declaration. I'm sure often it feels like civil society and states are in a kind of confrontational relationship. Well, of course, a little bit of contestation is needed, but ultimately we want to be turning up and applauding states for joining a political declaration that is achieving a humanitarian effect. So we want to be supporting this, but it does need to be a declaration that contains sufficient response to the humanitarian challenges that we're dealing with. I think in your comments at the beginning, Chair, you pointed to the need for meaningful commitments and a meaningful response to the issue we're faced with. And I think that is vital. I mean, if we are to be realistic, I think it's fair to say that not all states in this room are going to join the declaration. And of course, we'll encourage everybody to do so, but not all states will join. And I think we should have no fear of that. These have been open and inclusive conversations. A diversity of voices have been heard, but ultimately we recognize that in the end decisions will need to be made, and we should have no fear that certain states will not come with us at the beginning of this journey. Perhaps this is, I think, normal in these situations. But I think we can take a lot of confidence and encouragement from the tone of the conversation that has been set this week, that with having the sort of communication, open communication across different constituencies, civil society, states, international organizations, UN agencies, we're able to have a sort of open communication that really can provide a building block for stronger humanitarian protections in the future. And I think will be a key foundation for a collaborative mode of implementation work once this declaration is agreed. So not only, I think, have you stewarded this process very effectively in terms of the text, but you've also built a tone and a mode of communication here in the room that is very valuable and greatly appreciated. So perhaps just to pick up on John's rugby playing metaphor, as we approach the try line, I think we have every confidence that you will not drop the ball. So thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'm going to give the floor now to OCHA.
Thank you, Ambassador Gaffey. As this round of consultation is coming to a close, we would like to express on behalf of OCHA and the other 7 UN entities I speak for today our sincere thanks for the way you and your team conducted the debates over the past 3 days and for all your tireless efforts over the past years. We very much appreciate your efforts to include not only a large part of the UN membership, but also the UN Secretariat, UN agencies, the ICRC and NGOs in this discussion. So thank you for that. We have, during the past days, reminded on several occasions the call of the Secretary General to better protect civilians and avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. We welcome the overall constructive and respectful response most delegations gave to the SG's call and the spirit of compromise that prevailed throughout the discussions. Many delegations repeated their shared commitment to IHL and the protection of civilians, and this is, of course, essential. Several also made interesting suggestions to bring participants closer around key provisions. Based on that, we are hopeful that an agreement on a declaration that would not simply repeat IHL obligations, but also echo the SG's call and help trigger a genuine qualitative shift and the development of innovative policies and practices to enhance the protection of civilians on the ground can be found. In support of your efforts to finalize the declaration, we would like to draw your attention and the attention of delegations present to the extensive research conducted by UNIDIR on the concept of reverberating effect from the use of a wiper. We hope UNIDIR work can help answer some of the questions raised by several delegations during the past days on the effects of the use of a wiper, and from there help delegations build consensus towards a wording acceptable to all on these issues. UNIDIR research also offers a framework to unpack and document those effects. Overall, Ambassador Gaffey, we leave these consultations with the feeling that an agreement around the political declaration that is feasible and meaningful, to use the words of others during the past days, might be close. And if you look at where we were only 5 or 6 years ago on the issue of EWIPA, the progress made so far is absolutely considerable. This owes much to you, Mr. Chair, to your team, and to all who's present in this room. And we are grateful to all of you for this. But the work is not over yet. And we encourage all delegations to remain constructively engaged until the declaration is finalized. Ultimately, the success will be measured by the extent of the commitments made by member states and the tangible effects on the conduct of hostilities and the protection of civilians on the ground. As of this afternoon, we have achieved nothing. 90% of casualties of EWIPA are still civilians, and we have a responsibility to change that. Mr. Chair, you can rest assured of the United Nations Secretariat and the agency's continued support in your efforts to finalize the declaration and to implement it and to address the humanitarian consequences of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our speakers list, and probably everyone is ready to look towards leaving the room. So let me say thank you very much. I just want to say a few words on the process before we close the meeting. I think we are all more than aware that we have been meeting and discussing against a background of evidence on our screens of civilian harm in war every hour of every day that we have met. And I think the exchange of views that we've had and the spirit with which we have had them here in this room shows that there is a strong commitment to making progress and developing a political declaration on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. I think that is something that we need to take, that we together need to take forward. We have shown a lot of trust in each other over the last 3 days, and we need to continue to do that. Now, at the beginning of the consultations, I encourage delegations to submit their views in writing. As I said, we've received some already, but I'm just emphasizing again that any delegation who took the floor, please, if you could, forward your remarks and any specific drafting points directly to our team or to the email address genevaconsultations@dfa.ie. And I know that many delegations are still working on them. I'm not going to set a hard and fast deadline, but I really would ask that you submit them as soon as possible, and if possible, by next Friday, Good Friday, the 15th of April. In the interest of the inclusivity and transparency that we've worked for throughout the process, with your permission, we will share these submissions on our EWIPA webpage, which is at www.dfa.ie/EWIPA. Now, the next steps we are going to take relatively quickly. We need to reflect on your statements, on your submissions, and then we would intend to further refine the text in what we would hope will be close to a final draft of a political declaration on the basis of these consultations and written submissions and ongoing discussions which we will be having with you over the coming weeks. Our aim then is to hold one final consultation of 1 day. We don't intend to hold another comprehensive reading of the text. We feel that our 3 days here was hugely productive, and that the urgency and the momentum that we have leads us to, it seems realistic and feasible, to use a word, to move towards a 1-day consultation to finalize the text and make some final minor tweaks. Now, the main constraint, or the thing we don't know, is exactly when and where we'll have those consultations, because we need to work with UNOG on the availability of our room. But we will complete that work as soon as possible, I hope, and we would aim to have those consultations in early June. We would then aim to circulate our text 4 weeks before that, so that delegations can come with firm instructions and views on the text. So that's quite an ambitious and tight timeline. I'm very aware of that. We're looking at assessing and reviewing your contributions, coming up with the text over the next month, and then having a month in between before we meet for the final one-day consultation. But I stress, we will remain in touch and in contact with you throughout this, because I know that work is underway and discussions are underway on formulations which will help us reach what we want, which is a strong political declaration that has impact on people's lives and on behaviour. Once the text has been finalised at that meeting, we would then look to hold an adoption ceremony in the following months, a more political level meeting. You will recall that we had planned to hold such a ceremony in Dublin in May 2020, which is already 2 years ago. And we don't yet have firm plans for such an adoption ceremony because we have been so focused on getting the strongest text possible. I think, however, that the mood and the progress that we have seen over the last 3 days makes it possible for us to think about that now in more concrete terms, which we will do. So we will remain in contact with you. We will be ambitious. We will move the process forward. We will kind of try and maintain the trust that has built up in this room over recent days. And we really look forward to finalizing a meaningful political declaration with you over the next 2 months. And on that note, I know that everybody is tired. I know it's the end of the week. So all I will do now is thank you very, very sincerely, wish you a safe journey home and a very good, relaxing weekend where you're perhaps not looking at texts on explosive weapons in populated areas. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you back here before too long. Thank you.